What's up, guys? Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over a pretty fun topic. We're going to be going over falling through platforms, one-way platforms to be specific. Now with this, we do need some crouching functionality, so we also have the initial crouch functionality in, mainly being able to go to the crouching state and return, as well as to perform some logic to determine what we want to do when we're in the crouching state. However, this is far from finished. We're going to be having a separate episode on crouch attacks and changing the size of the hitbox when you crouch for crouching. So just so you're aware, there will be some things that we leave unfinished regarding crouching. However, since we did the one-way platforms and jumping through them in the previous episode, I wanted to have the ability to fall through them as well. I think this is really important because A, it finishes up our one-way platforms section, but also because it starts getting us into the idea of all these things when we're working with multiple players. So as with jumping through platforms, we want to make sure we can fall through these one-way platforms without messing with any of the other characters on the platform. Just like that. So, that's what we'll be covering today. It's actually pretty simple. We only have to make a few adjustments to what we already have, and we have to add our crouching state logic. Let's go into our SSB template character, or our code. And before we get started, I just want to let you guys know, I believe we're on episode 20 of the Super Smash Brothers tutorial series, the platform fighter tutorial series as a whole. So if you're interested in catching up, I'll leave a link to the playlist right here in the icon in the top right corner of this video. I will also leave the previous episode with one-way platforms that you will need if you want to perform this episode where we can fall through one-way platforms right here in this iCard. All right, then to get started, where we're going to want to go is our SSB template character.h, and I'll start up at the top. So in the previous few episodes, we had these things called character states, and this allowed me to do things like, fall through the revival platform or get off the revival platform, die, respawn, all these different things. And so you'll specifically notice that there is not a crouching state here. This is because we want to be able to crouch and do other things as well. So you technically could have a crouching state and have some substates in there. But for me, I want to have crouch as a Boolean, and I want to have the other things like if we're using an attack ball crouch, that can all be separate. We don't want to limit this in the character state. And I mentioned this when I created the character state, that there's some states we'll probably update or remove later, depending on the logic we need. But I just want to let you know that I don't have a crouching state. I'm specifically using a Boolean. So some of the logic that we're adding today, we're going to add two Booleans. We're going to add one for is crouching, and we're going to add one for is on one-way platform. In the previous episode, we determined if we were able to land on a one-way platform, and that works perfectly fine. But we didn't really have any logic for if we were, actually on the platform currently. We essentially just did a raycast down at the ground to determine what object was hitting and what object we were going to land on next. But now we're going to have a way to keep track of this so we know kind of where our character's at, so we know, depending on what actions they do, what result we want to have. And then is crouching is pretty simple. Of course, we want this so that we can determine what animation to go to and what action the player is currently doing. On top of this, note that the base character class, not our SSB template character, but the actual Unreal A character class, has a is crouched Boolean. I'm not using it for reasons. Quite frankly, I'm not going to be using their crouch system the way it's set up. We're going to be making our own. So I've made this new Boolean. Just notice if you called this Boolean is crouched, it'll talk to you about some overriding stuff. So I'd recommend calling it is crouching specifically, or, just crouching, whatever you'd like to know that it's different. If you would like to use the A character class and are familiar with how variables work in inheritance, it's actually very simple to use it. I'm just avoiding it altogether because there are some functions that Unreal uses that will set those values and set those variables, and I kind of want to separate them entirely so that we can modify the character in a way where we can use our crouch but have full control of the system. So that's just my personal preference, but I wanted to point it out in case anyone calls this is crouched, that if you run into issues, that could be why. And then, as I said, this Boolean to determine if we're on the platform or not. Once you've made these two, you're good to go with the variables. We do want to add another function. Specifically, we're actually going to add two functions for crouching and one function that is a blueprint implementable event. Let's start with the crouching functions. I made them both blueprint callable, although they aren't required right now. We're not going to be using them in blueprint currently. And I have void start crouch and void stop crouch. One other note on this, since they do have crouch functions in Unreal, they call them crouch and uncrouch. So you can see I've called mine start crouch and stop crouch to avoid any confusion. All right. So make these two functions, and then also make a function with ufunction. Instead of blueprint callable, the ufunction is blueprint implementable event. And I've called it fall through platform. You can call it fall through one-way platform or whatever you want. Basically, this is what's the event that's going to occur, that when we press a key, specifically in this case, just anytime we crouch when we're on a one-way platform, don't worry, this will probably get updated to when you crouch and maybe press the jump key, or crouch, if you press down twice within a certain number of frames or seconds. However, we'll adjust that later. For now, to not complicate things, we're just getting the fall through logic done. We can update all of our commands and controls later. But you can see it's a blueprint implementable event because we're going to call the function in code and the logic is going to be performed on the blueprint side. All right, and now that's the header file. Let's go to the CPP of our SSB template character, or whatever your base character is. You can set your values to your defaults. Specifically, we'll want is crouching to be false because when the character starts, they're not starting in the crouching state. And is on one-way platform to be false. It's okay if your characters start on a one-way platform. Like, say you have a map where you have multiple one-way platforms and spawn points are there. It's okay if they spawn there. The logic in the blueprint will determine if they're actually over top of it. So it's okay to have a default value like false and still allow it to work. Technically, it doesn't really matter because it will be updated on tick. So as long as you don't allow them to fall through during their entrance animation or something silly like that, you won't run into any trouble anyway, but it's always good to set your variables when you can. Okay. Now, what we need to do is add inputs that call our start crouch and stop crouch functions. So I'll show this again in a second, but let's go into the editor and let's do what we always do when we want to add new keys. We go to Edit, Project Settings, Input, and you can see I have crouch. Now, we will also want to add all of our keys for all of our keyboard players as well. So just like all the other ones, this is crouch for P1. You'll probably want to add crouch P2, P3, P4. Just to show you, in case it has been a while and you've forgotten, you can add a new action mapping and go crouch P2, and then add your keys. So for me, I just chose whatever the down key was within that section. So like I'm using for WASD for the controls for my first character, so I used S. For my next character, if I look at it, I'm using move right for P2 as F and H, so G would be the middle key there, so I can just do G. Remember, these P2s, all the ones that aren't just the regular name, are for keyboard controls only, so you don't have to worry about doing this for controller. You can see in crouch, I've chosen S and gamepad left thumbstick down. So for every gamepad left thumbstick down will work, but I do have the individual keyboard keys as well. So you can add P2, P3, and P4, and in fact, we'll do it quickly just so that you can see it in action for all characters. Crouch P3. And crouch P4. Whoops. And then the other keys here would be, let's see what move right 3 and 4 are. So we have J and L, so we have K for player 3 and the down arrow for player 4. So we have K and down. There we go. And now crouch is set up for all 4 of our players, keyboard or gamepad. All right. Now, in the code, in our setup player input component function, this is where we always bind our events with our functions. So you can kind of copy one of these other ones if you want, or you can just type it out, but just make sure that the data is replaced as it should be. So specifically here, I've added 2 events, one to bind the crouch for press, and one to bind it for release. So make sure this name in quotes matches exactly with the input action mapping that you just added, specifically the one without the P2, P3, P4, because we cover that in Blueprint for keyboard mode. We only care about the player 1 version, so crouch specifically is what I called mine. This is fine, the keyword there, and then this last argument is the function that we want to call. So we want to call start crouch when crouch is pressed, stop crouch when crouch is released. Okay, once you add this, then scroll down to wherever you want to make your functions. I called them, I just made them right under move right. Now, right now, it's very, very bare bones. I don't even check if we can move. I don't disable us from moving when we're crouching. I've left all that alone because we're going to have a different episode regarding the actual attacks and honestly some of the movement while crouching, because I do want to incorporate the ability to be able to crouch and walk for specific characters. So that's something we'll get into in a little bit later. However, this for now is good. This is going to allow us to go to a crouching state and to fall through our platforms. So make 2 functions. The ones that, whatever you call them in the header file, make those 2. Start crouch and stop crouch. The logic in them is very simple. I'm setting is crouching, the boolean we made, to be true in start crouch. And then I'm checking our other boolean if is on one-way platform, which is essentially checking if that boolean is true. So if we are on a one-way platform and we call start crouch, which means we press the down key, then we want to fall through the platform. We'll fill out this logic in the blueprint, so don't worry about it. And then on stop crouch, I just set is crouching to be false. That's all I do. There's more we'll do in the future, but just to reset our state. Now, if we pull this back up and we go back to the Unreal Engine, so build all that, and then go into your animation blueprint. We have to set up our animations. I've added a crouching animation, which I'll split this up so that we have start crouch, crouch idle, and probably a getting back up pose as well. Although with Unreal's blend animation abilities, you don't really need to have another one. But I have that animation. So if we go into our anim BP for our character, you can see I moved the states around slightly. I didn't change anything with any of these states. I just moved these up since I don't really think walking needs to be below idle. Makes it a little bit confusing. Whereas we should have crouch below idle technically. And I moved the crouch attack state down for when we want to add this next time. Okay, so everything here is all the same. Nothing changed there. The only thing that's changed with this graph, other than the position of these nodes, is specifically I've added a new state called start crouch. So add state, and then I called it start crouch, and I added a transition from idle to start crouch and start crouch back to idle. So you can see I have nothing on this state as far as events and nothing as far as transition events. It's very, very basic state. All we have is one rule from there, from idle to start crouch and from start crouch to idle. So double click, go to your transition rule, and it's about as simple as you can imagine. The idle to start crouch transition is that the character reference is crouching. So if this boolean is true, which we set to true when we press the down key, then we can go to this state. Now, likewise, start crouch back to idle, very simple, except make sure that the character reference is crouching not. So basically, if is crouching is false, we can go from start crouch back to idle. Very, very simple logic. Then in the start crouch function itself, I'm playing my crouching animation. I gave it a play rate of 8 to speed it up because crouching should be very quick, really only a couple frames. But right now we don't have any sort of frame system. I have this long animation, so I just sped up the animation a lot. Okay. And doing that alone with the code that we did earlier should allow you to crouch and cancel crouching by releasing that button. Okay. Then, if we go to our character BP, not our animation blueprint, but our actual character blueprint, I had 2, remember. Right now, I've only done it for this one because we're going to kind of consolidate some of this and make a base blueprint character we can use so we don't have to duplicate our logic. If you're familiar with the fighting game, it's going to be very similar to that. So you may want to hold off doing this for all your characters. And only just do it for one character for right now. Okay. Now, there's a few things we need to do in here, and they're all pretty simple. But if you watch the previous episode about jumping through one-way platforms, we had on event tick we were calling determine can land on platform, and we were basically doing a bunch of logic to draw a ray trace or a line trace to check if it was a one-way platform object, and then if it was, be able to block the collision. And we did this to make sure that our character would not disable collision with the component. That way the component itself would drop any players that were already standing on it. We only want to allow the player's collision to take this into effect. And so this function is exactly the same as it was, except for the very last nodes. These were the two last nodes, set collision response to channel. You can see I've added a few nodes after this branch. This branch was already here, but I've added another branch on the true condition, and I've added 2 sets to is on one-way platform. So the logic here is pretty simple. Basically, before what we were doing was if the collision of the ray trace was a one-way platform object type, that meant that we were basically above a one-way platform, and thus we could land on that platform. So we set the response to that object type to be block. Otherwise, if this was false, we did not find a one-way platform. We wanted to overlap collision from one-way platforms, the opposite. That way we could fall through them or just ignore them entirely so we could jump through them again. Now, we want the ability to fall through one-way platforms if we crouch. And because of that, we kind of have to make sure that we do this in the right order. Otherwise, it'll never allow us to jump through them again, or it'll never allow us to fall through them, depending on how we set it up. So a good way to do this is if we ignore this branch to start, let's just start with the last nodes. After these 2 nodes where you're setting your collision response to channel, again, we already did this in the last episode, so you should have these nodes. Then just call set is on one-way platform, the variable that we made in code. If your response is block, yes, we are on a one-way platform because this is running on tick. So as soon as our response is no longer block, that means we are no longer finding a one-way platform below us, which means we are not on a one-way platform. So if it's block, we're on the platform. If it's overlap, we're not on the platform. See how the block is checked and the overlap is not. And that actually works off the bat. That is all we need to be able to tell the system whether we're on the platform or not. This other thing where we check to see if on one-way platform is false before blocking will come into play once we are able to crouch and fall through the platform. So I'll explain that in 1 second. Let's take a step back. So you should have this in here for now. And hopefully that makes sense. Now, if we go back to our event graph, that blueprint implementable event we called fall through platform, the one we called in the code right here, that guy, we can fill him out with data. So all we do is right click anywhere in the graph and we call event fall through platform. When you click it, it will create this event as a node in the event graph. Now, what we're going to do here is I'm going to take our capsule component, set the collision response to channel, a one-way platform to overlap. This is the exact same thing that we're doing here. So you can literally copy this node, specifically the overlap one, and paste it here. And what we're doing is overriding the logic so that regardless of if the raycast makes sense to block our input or block our falling so that we can land on the one-way platform, we're going to ignore that and just automatically fall through the platform. That is what we want to do. We want to fall through the platform. We don't want to be blocked by it if we're crouching. And because of that, that'll work, and we'll fall right through it because we disabled our collision. We made it to where it's overlapping. It's not blocking us anymore. Tick is going to always outperform this. It's going to run every frame and say, should I block or should I overlap? So if this line trace says there is a one-way platform below you, then even if you set it to be overlap, it's going to come back in and set it to block anyway. Now, you could put a delay here or something like that, but you're playing with fire because if you want to change the fall through rate or the gravity, all these other things, it could still get messed up where its responses overlap, but then it gets forced to block and you don't fall through the platform. So the best way to do this is to set the collision response when this event fires to be overlap. But then in the determine can land on platform, this node, this branch that we added. Now, the purpose of this is we're checking if is on one-way platform is false before we set it to be block. The reason for that is because we will only block then. The only time we set is on one-way platform to false is either initially when we start the game. Other than that is when the character does not have a one-way platform underneath of them. Okay, so even if you were to fall through the platform by pressing down, the raycast is still going to happen. But you can see that we don't set is on one-way platform to be false in the event graph. We only set it if the raycast doesn't find anything. This is super important because this will allow us to fall through the platform. And because is on one-way platform is true at the current time, we do want to fall through it. Even if the raycast says, hey, I'm finding a one-way platform, we are overriding it. We are telling the game, no, we want to disable collision. We want to make it overlap so that the character can fall through. So let me show you what I mean. If I did not have this in here, so say I skip this branch and we leave it out entirely, the system will work to a good extent. We can land on one-way platforms and we can try and fall through. But you can see that I can't actually get through because what's happening is it's trying to allow me to ignore collision, but then event tick just runs, says, oh, I haven't fallen enough from the last frame. So this runs and it says, yes, the ray trace is hitting a one-way platform. So then it sets the collision to block. If we make sure that the is on one-way platform has to be false before blocking, this means that we have to fall the entire way through the platform until the ray trace no longer picks up on it, in which case it will allow block again. This is great for two reasons. This will allow us to fall through a platform and land on another one-way platform down below. Now, there could be some issues with that depending on timing and things, which we can set a lifetime that's required. That's something we'll cover actually relatively soon because there's a few things that I want to cover with it that are going to have to be covered outside of one-way platforms anyway. So we'll talk about that more when we get into it, and you'll know what I mean when we get there. But other than that, it will let you fall through a one-way platform, land on another one-way platform. It'll actually let you fall through a one-way platform and jump back through the same. Because say you were able to get through the one-way platform, but we didn't do a branch and we just disabled collision. When you tried to jump back through, it would actually stop you because it would think you were still on the platform. So you would fall through and you would say, okay, that works, right? You would not be able to jump back through because we wouldn't have reset the Boolean. And thus, that's not what we want. So this is the best way that I know of to do this, where it causes no issues. You can jump through the platform, fall underneath the platform as many times as you want and without hurting the other characters around you. Yeah, that's pretty much all I got. So if you want to add this for all your characters, very, very simple. You go to where we have all of our keyboard mode options. I didn't have them prior, but we can do it right now very quickly. You just grab the correct crouch for the player that we are doing it on. You grab the correct character and make sure that they're valid. And then you call the correct function. So start crouch on player 2. Okay. And then you do the same for player 3 and the same for player 4. Crouch P3. Validate get for player 3. Start crouch. Okay. And lastly, probably guessed it by now, crouch P4. Validate get for player 4. And start crouch. And then don't forget, when you release the key, we also want to make sure that we stop crouching. So for each of these, on release, make sure that it's valid, but then call stop crouch as well. There we go. So it should look like this with crouch player 2. If it's pressed, we make sure that the reference is valid and we call start crouch and stop crouch. Same with player 3 and same with player 4. And now if we were to play our game, all of our characters should be able to fall through the platforms if I do this correctly. So there's player 4, fell through perfectly fine. Player 1 fell through perfectly fine. Figure out all my keys here. Nope, don't jump off the edge. Here we go. Player 2 fell through perfectly fine. And lastly, player 3 fell through perfectly fine. There we go. All right, guys, so that's all I got for you today. Hopefully this helped you with falling through platforms and crouching in general. If it did, please subscribe. It does more for me and the channel than anything else, and I just really appreciate it. I want to give a huge shout out to all my YouTube membership and Patreon supporters. Thank you guys so much for continuing to support the series and put your faith into this. I am so excited about how this is going to turn out and what we're going to do with the series, so thank you so much. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community that we have. There's a link in the description. I'll be happy to help you out and get you situated with any problems you're having. That's all I got for you today, guys, so thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.